In the grand hall of Henshaw Manor, a joyous wedding toast turns deadly when Evelyn Carver collapses, poisoned by a single sip of champagne. As secrets unravel, Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, weaves through a web of old grudges and hidden motives. Was it the nervous best man, stung by rejection, the protective bride, guarding her new life, or the caterer, wounded by a lost contract? With a scratched cufflink, a cryptic letter, and a vial's fragments, Marple sets a trap to catch a killer, revealing that even love can hide a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The Joyous Occasion. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning bathed in the soft golden light of early summer, its hedgerows glistening with dew and its cottages exhaling a quiet charm. The air carried the faint scent of roses and freshly cut grass, mingling with the anticipation that pulsed through the narrow lanes. Today was no ordinary day. It was the wedding of Clara Henshaw, the only daughter of the late Dr. Henshaw, to Harold Winthrop, a barrister whose rising star had been the talk of the county. The ceremony was to be held at Henshaw Manor, a venerable estate draped in ivy, its tall windows catching the sunlight like the facets of a jewel. Miss Jane Marple, a distant cousin of Clara's mother, had arrived the previous evening, her modest suitcase deposited in the guest room of the manor. She sat now in the cool shade of the ancient church, her small, bird-like figure tucked into a pew near the back. Her hands, delicate but sure, worked steadily at her knitting, a pale blue shawl destined for a neighbor's newborn. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle. They darted about the gathering congregation, noting the smallest details. The way the vicar adjusted his spectacles with a nervous twitch, the flutter of Clara's veil as she entered on her uncle's arm, the faint sheen of perspiration on the brow of Lionel Drake, the best man, as he fussed with his tie. Clara, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, moved with a grace that belied the weight of the day. Her smile was serene, her eyes bright with the promise of a new life. Harold, standing tall at the altar, cut a fine figure in his tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed, though Miss Marple noted a fleeting shadow in his expression, perhaps the strain of the occasion or something deeper. She filed the observation away, her needles clicking rhythmically, a counterpoint to the organ's gentle strains. Among the guests, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on two figures in particular. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, the caterer, bustled in and out of the church's side door, her round face flushed as she issued whispered instructions to her staff. Her efficiency was admirable, but there was a tightness to her mouth that suggested more than the usual pressures of her trade. Then there was Evelyn Carver, seated a few rows ahead, her auburn hair catching the light through the stained glass windows. Evelyn, a barrister like Harold, was a striking woman, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed not on the bride, but on the groom. Miss Marple, who had a knack for recalling village gossip, remembered whispers of a rivalry between Evelyn and Harold, dating back to their university days. A scholarship won, a reputation bruised. Such things, she knew, could linger like a stain. The ceremony proceeded without incident, the vows exchanged with a sincerity that brought a tear to many an eye. As the organ swelled and the newlyweds processed down the aisle, Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. The reception awaited in the manor's grand hall, a room of polished oak and glittering chandeliers, where tables groaned under the weight of Mrs. Finch's culinary efforts. The guests, released from the church's solemnity, filled the hall with laughter and chatter, their glasses clinking as they toasted the couple's health. Miss Marple found a seat near a window, her view affording her a clear sight of the head table. Clara and Harold sat at its center, their hands entwined, though Miss Marple noted Harold's fingers tighten briefly as Evelyn Carver approached to offer her congratulations. The exchange was polite, but there was a coolness in Evelyn's smile, a sharpness that Miss Marple's keen eyes did not miss. Lionel Drake, as best man, rose to deliver the toast. He was a lanky man, with a boyish face that belied his 30 years, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his champagne flute. "To love, to trust, to a future bright," he proclaimed, his voice carrying a note of forced cheer. The guests raised their glasses, the champagne sparkling like liquid sunlight. Miss Marple sipped sparingly, her attention fixed on Evelyn, who lifted her glass with a deliberate slowness, her eyes locked on Harold. The moment shattered with a gasp. Evelyn's glass slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor in a spray of crystal and foam. She clutched her throat, her face twisting in agony, her body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. A scream rose from a nearby guest, and the hall descended into chaos. Dr. Haydock, a retired physician among the guests, pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Evelyn. His fingers sought a pulse, but his expression darkened. "She's gone," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their work, stilled. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room, the shock on Clara's face, the pallor of Lionel's cheeks, the way Mrs. Finch's hands froze mid-gesture as she directed her staff. Harold's gaze lingered on the shattered glass, his jaw tight. The air, once festive, now hung heavy with suspicion. This, Miss Marple knew, was no mere tragedy. It was murder. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The grand hall of Henshaw Manor, moments ago a stage for celebration, now bore the oppressive weight of calamity. The chandeliers, which had cast a warm glow over the wedding feast, seemed to flicker with an accusatory light, illuminating the stunned faces of the guests. Evelyn Carver's body lay crumpled on the polished oak floor, her auburn hair fanned out like a dark halo, her lips parted in a final, silent gasp. The shattered remnants of her champagne flute glittered cruelly in the spilled liquid, a stark reminder of the toast that had preceded her collapse. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the tall windows, overlooking the rose garden, set her knitting aside, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to unraveling the threads of human deceit. Inspector Crane, the local constable, arrived with a brisk efficiency that belied the gravity of the situation. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a mustache that seemed perpetually poised to bristle. His reputation in St. Mary Mead was one of competence, though Miss Marple knew from past encounters that he sometimes missed the subtler currents of motive and opportunity. He strode into the hall, his boots echoing on the floor, and surveyed the chaos with a frown. "Nobody leaves," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is now a crime scene." Dr. Haydock, who had remained by Evelyn's side, rose stiffly, his face grim. "Cyanide, I'd wager," he said quietly to the inspector, ensuring the guests could not overhear. "The symptoms, convulsions, the bluish tint to her lips, are unmistakable. Death was near instantaneous." He gestured toward the shattered glass. "It was in the champagne, I'm certain." Miss Marple, though seated some distance away, caught the doctor's words. Her mind, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, began to weave a pattern from the fragments of the scene. Cyanide, a poison swift and merciless, required intent and access. She glanced at the head table, where Clara Winthrop, née Henshaw, clutched her new husband's arm, her face pale but composed. Harold Winthrop's expression was harder to read. His eyes darted toward the fallen glass, then away, as if unwilling to meet the reality of the moment. Lionel Drake, the best man, stood frozen near the table, his hands twisting together, his boyish features drained of color. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, the caterer, hovered near the service door, her stout frame trembling as she muttered to a young assistant about the ruined reputation of her business. Inspector Crane wasted no time. He summoned his sergeant, a young man named Baxter, and instructed him to cordon off the hall. The guests, a mix of local gentry and distant relations, were herded into an adjoining parlor, their murmurs rising into a chorus of indignation and fear. Miss Marple, however, remained where she was, her unobtrusive presence overlooked in the flurry of activity. She preferred it that way. Invisibility, she had long found, was a detective's greatest ally. The inspector knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the evidence. He examined the glass, fragments noting their position, and signaled for a constable to collect them for analysis. The champagne, he said to Dr. Haydock, came from a single bottle, correct? The doctor nodded. As far as I know, the toast was poured from a tray. Everyone drank from the same batch. Miss Marple's needles, though stilled, seemed to echo in her mind as she considered this. A single bottle suggested a targeted act, for only Evelyn had fallen. Her glass, then, was the key. She recalled the moment of the toast, Lionel raising his flute, the guests following suit, the clink of crystal resounding through the hall. Evelyn's glass had been at her place, untouched until that fatal sip. Had it been tampered with before the tray reached the table, or in the fleeting seconds of distraction? Inspector Crane turned his attention to the staff. Mrs. Finch, summoned from her nervous pacing, approached with a defensive air. "My girls handled everything properly," she insisted, her voice sharp with indignation. "The bottles were delivered yesterday, sealed and pristine. I opened them myself just before the toast, and the glasses were cleaned and polished this morning, not a speck of dust on them." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "And who poured the champagne?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, her hands smoothing her apron. "My assistant, Mary, filled the tray, but I oversaw it, and Mr. Drake, he helped carry the tray out, said it was part of his duties as best man." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Lionel, who stood near the head table, his gaze fixed on the floor. His cufflinks, silver and engraved, caught the light as he rubbed them absently, a nervous habit she had noted during the ceremony. She made a mental note to inquire further about his role in the toast's preparation. A best man carrying a tray was unusual, but not unheard of in a small affair like this. Still, it placed him in proximity to the fatal glass. Clara approached next, maintained her composure with an effort that Miss Marple found admirable. "I was with Harold most of the time," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't touch the tray, though I did adjust the table settings earlier, flowers, napkins, that sort of thing." Her eyes, large and expressive, met the inspector's without flinching. "Evelyn was a guest, nothing more. I can't imagine why anyone would do this." Harold, standing beside her, nodded in agreement, though his jaw tightened as the inspector pressed further. Miss Carver was a colleague of yours, wasn't she, Mr. Winthrop? Crane asked, his tone deceptively mild. Yes, Harold replied, his voice clipped. We studied law together at Oxford. She was competitive, but that was years ago. He offered no more, and Miss Marple noted the brevity of his response. A man guarding a secret, perhaps, or simply shaken by the death of an acquaintance. The inspector moved on, questioning the staff who had served the champagne. Mary, Mrs. Finch's assistant, was a nervous girl of 19, her hands trembling as she recounted her actions. I filled the glasses, sir, just as Mrs. Finch told me, all from the same bottle. I didn't see anything unusual. Her eyes darted toward Lionel, then away, as if afraid to linger. Miss Marple, listening quietly, found this exchange illuminating. The tray, the bottle, the glasses, all points of access, yet none clearly implicated. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a poisoned cordial had felled a churchwarden. The poison then had been slipped into a single glass during a moment of distraction. Was this a parallel? Her mind turned to the layout of the hall, the service door to the kitchen, the side entrance to the garden, the bustling movement of guests and staff. Opportunity, she knew, was as critical as motive. As the inspector continued his inquiries, Miss Marple rose and approached the head table, her steps slow and deliberate. She bent slightly, as if to retrieve a dropped stitch, but her eyes scanned the floor near Evelyn's chair. A faint smear of wax, barely noticeable, marked the table's edge, a residue, perhaps, from a candle or a seal. She filed this away, her thoughts turning to the possibility of a vial or container. Cyanide, she knew, was not a substance one carried casually. It required planning, precision, and a cold resolve. The guests, now sequestered in the parlor, were a study in contrasts. Some whispered in hushed tones, speculating wildly. Others sat in stunned silence, their champagne flutes abandoned on nearby tables. Miss Marple slipped into the parlor, taking a seat near Mrs. Lavinia Price, a local gossip whose tongue was as sharp as her memory. Dreadful business, Mrs. Price murmured, leaning close. I always said that Evelyn Carver had enemies. Too ambitious, that one, and those university rivalries. Oh, they never fade, do they? Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of information. Indeed, Mrs. Price. Did you know Miss Carver well? Not well, but enough, Mrs. Price replied, her eyes gleaming. She was at Oxford with Harold, you know. There was talk of a scandal, a scholarship she lost to him, and a nasty rumor she spread in revenge. Some said she never forgave him. And then there's Lionel Drake. Poor boy was sweet on her once, but she laughed him off. Humiliated him, they say. Miss Marple's expression remained bland, but her mind catalogued these details. A spurned suitor, a professional rival, both classic motives, yet neither conclusive. She recalled Lionel's nervous demeanor during the toast, the way his hands had trembled, and Harold's guarded responses suggested a history he preferred to keep buried. As for Clara, her composure was almost too perfect, as if she were holding something back. Mrs. Finch, too, had a stake in this. Her business, already struggling, could not withstand the scandal of a poisoned guest. The inspector, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the tray itself, now resting on a sideboard. It held a dozen glasses, most still half full, their contents untouched since the tragedy. He instructed Sergeant Baxter to bag each one for analysis, though Miss Marple doubted they would yield much. The poison, she suspected, had been targeted solely at Evelyn's glass, a precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of the seating arrangements. As the afternoon waned, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier, the festive decorations now mocking in their cheer. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the window, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. She watched as Lionel paced near the service door, his cufflinks glinting with each agitated gesture. Clara and Harold conferred in low tones, their heads bent together, while Mrs. Finch issued orders to her staff with a forced air of authority. Each, Miss Marple knew, had had the opportunity to tamper with the glass, but opportunity alone was not enough. Motive, means, and a moment of distraction, these were the pieces she needed to fit together. Inspector Crane approached her at last, his expression a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "I know you've a knack for these things. Any thoughts?" She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. "Only that it's curious, Inspector, how a single glass could be poisoned when all were poured from the same bottle. I wonder who knew Miss Carver would sit at that precise spot." Crane's mustache twitched. "You think it was planned?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly, "that someone in this room is cleverer than they seem, and more dangerous." The inspector nodded, his gaze sweeping the hall. "We'll test the glasses, the bottle, everything. But if it's cyanide, it could have come from anywhere. A chemist, a laboratory, even a garden shed." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts drifting to the village chemist, Mr. Hodges, who was known to stock such substances for legitimate purposes. She made a mental note to inquire discreetly. For now, she contented herself with observing, her mind sifting through the faces, the gestures, the half-spoken truths. Evelyn Carver's death was no accident, but a calculated act, born of a grudge that had festered in the shadows of this joyous occasion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manor's lawns, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of intuition. The truth, she knew, lay not in the grand gestures, but in the small ones. The glance averted, the hand that lingered, the secret buried in plain sight. She would find it, as she always did, with patience and a keen eye for the frailties of the human heart. Chapter 3. The Best Man's Burden. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall, mullioned windows of Henshaw Manor, its golden rays fractured into a lattice of shadows that danced across the grand hall's polished oak floor. The festive air that had filled the space mere hours ago had dissipated, replaced by a heavy pall of suspicion and dread. The chandeliers, once sparkling with celebratory light, now seemed to cast an accusatory glow over the scene where Evelyn Carver had fallen, her lifeless form, a stark reminder of the poison that had silenced her forever. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner near a window overlooking the rose garden, had set her knitting aside, her small, bird-like frame still as her sharp blue eyes catalogued the subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere. The guests, confined to the adjoining parlor under Inspector Crane's orders, murmured in restless clusters, their voices a low hum of fear and speculation. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were fixed on Lionel Drake, the best man, whose nervous demeanor during the fatal toast had sparked her curiosity. Inspector Crane, a tall man with a weathered face and a mustache that seemed perpetually on the verge of bristling, had summoned Lionel for questioning in a small study off the hall. The room, with its dark oak paneling and shelves of leather-bound books, exuded a solemnity that seemed to press down on Lionel's already fragile composure. Miss Marple, invited by Crane to sit in as an observer, a nod to her reputation for unraveling the village's secrets, took a seat by the window, her knitting bag resting on her lap. The pale blue shawl she was crafting for a neighbor's newborn lay untouched, a prop for her unobtrusive presence. Her eyes, keen and unyielding, followed every gesture, every flicker of expression. Lionel stood before the inspector, his lanky frame slightly hunched, his fingers twisting at the silver cufflinks engraved with his initials, L.D. His boyish face, which might have been charming under different circumstances, was now pale, his hazel eyes darting between Crane and the floor. "I don't know how it happened, Inspector," he said, his voice catching like a snagged thread. "I poured the champagne myself from the bottle Mrs. Finch provided. Everyone drank from the same tray. How could it have been poisoned?" There was a pleading note in his tone, but Miss Marple noted the way. His fingers lingered on those cufflinks, rubbing them as if seeking comfort in their familiar weight. Crane leaned forward, his pen poised over a notebook, his mustache twitching with a skepticism that bordered on disdain. "You were in charge of the toast, Mr. Drake. You carried the tray, you handed out the glasses. If anyone had the chance to tamper with Miss Carver's drink, it was you." Lionel's hands shot up, palms outward, as if to ward off the accusation. The cufflinks gleamed briefly in the dim light. "I didn't touch her glass specifically. I set the tray down, and the guests took their own. I swear it." His voice rose, edged with desperation, and Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, registered the tremor in his fingers. A nervous tick, she thought, but was it born of guilt or merely the strain of being accused? She recalled a conversation from the village tea shop, where Mrs. Lavinia Price had leaned close over a pot of Earl Grey, her voice low with the relish of gossip. Lionel Drake was sweet on Evelyn Carver at Oxford, she had confided. Head over heels, poor lad, but she dismissed him, laughed in his face, called him a dreamer not worth her time. Such a rejection, Miss Marple knew, could fester, a wound that time did not always heal. "Tell me about your movements before the toast," Crane pressed, his tone firm but measured. "You were in the kitchen, weren't you, helping Mrs. Finch?" Lionel nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, but only for a moment. Mrs. Finch was short-handed, her assistant was struggling with the tray, and I offered to carry it out. It was heavy, with all those glasses. I didn't do anything else, just took it to the hall and set it down." He rubbed his cufflinks again, the gesture almost compulsive, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The act of carrying the tray was not unusual for a best man in a small, intimate wedding like this, but it placed him in the precise location where the poison might have been introduced. Opportunity, she thought, was a dangerous companion to motive. Crane's pen scratched across the notebook. "And you had no reason to wish Miss Carver harm? No old grudges from your university days?" Lionel's face flushed, a sudden rush of color that betrayed more than his words. "That was years ago," he said quickly. "We were students. Everyone had rivalries back then. Evelyn was intense, but I hadn't seen her in ages. Not until today." His voice faltered, and he looked away, his fingers returning to the cufflinks. Miss Marple noted the evasion, the way his answer skirted the heart of the question. She thought of another young man from St. Mary Mead, jilted by a girl who had mocked his ambitions. That lad had left the village, but the sting of humiliation had lingered, surfacing years later in a rash act. Was Lionel's story so different? The inspector shifted tactics. "Describe the kitchen, Mr. Drake. Who else was there? What did you see?" Lionel hesitated, his brow furrowing as if reconstructing the scene. It was busy. Mrs. Finch was barking orders, her assistant Mary was filling the glasses, and a couple of other girls were arranging plates. I didn't stay long. I took the tray and left through the service door to the hall. He paused, then added, "There was a side door to the garden, I think." It was open. Someone had propped it for air, I suppose. Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to click in her mind. An open door to the garden was a detail worth noting. It suggested access, not just for the staff, but for anyone who might have slipped in unnoticed. She made a mental note to examine that door later, perhaps on a pretext of admiring the roses. For now, her attention remained on Lionel, whose nervous energy seemed to fill the room like a gathering storm. Crane dismissed him with a curt nod, instructing him to remain in the parlor with the other guests. As Lionel exited, his shoulders slumped, Miss Marple rose and approached the inspector. "A word, if I may, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. Crane turned, his expression a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple, you've a knack for these things. What's on your mind?" She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. "Only that Mr. Drake seems rather unsettled. His cufflinks, you see, they're a habit, a comfort. But habits can betray as much as they conceal. I wonder if he knew Miss Carver better than he lets on." Crane's mustache twitched. "You think he's hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm, "that young men do not easily forget a public slight, and Mr. Drake had his hands on that tray, didn't he?" The inspector nodded, his gaze drifting to the door through which Lionel had disappeared. "We'll keep an eye on him. The glasses are being tested. Sergeant Baxter's taking them to the lab now. If there's poison, we'll find it." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the tray itself. She excused herself and slipped into the hall, where the remnants of the reception lay abandoned. The tray, now on a sideboard, held a dozen glasses, their contents undisturbed since the tragedy. She noted their arrangement, the way one glass, Evelyn's no doubt, had been placed at her specific seat. The precision of the act suggested foreknowledge, a plan laid with care. She bent slightly, as if adjusting her shawl, and examined the table's edge. A faint smear of wax, barely visible, caught her eye. A residue that might have come from a candle, or perhaps a sealed vial. She filed this away, her mind turning to the garden door Lionel had mentioned. Stepping into the parlor, she found the guests in a state of uneasy limbo. Mrs. Lavinia Price, ever the font of village lore, beckoned her over. "Dreadful, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Poor Evelyn, such a vibrant girl, but she made enemies. That business with Lionel at Oxford, you know. She humiliated him in front of their whole set, and Harold too. She tried to ruin him with some nasty rumor about a forged brief. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of gossip. "Indeed, Mrs. Price, it's curious how old wounds can resurface, isn't it?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lionel's not been the same since. He's done well enough, mind you, works in publishing now, but there's a bitterness there. And Evelyn turning up here, bold as brass, that can't have sat well." The information was a thread in the tapestry, Miss Marple was weaving. She thanked Mrs. Price and moved to the window, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond. The roses, in full bloom, swayed gently in the breeze, but her thoughts were on that open door. She resolved to inspect it, perhaps under the guise of a stroll. For now, she returned to her seat, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Lionel sat apart from the others, his head bowed, his fingers still at those cufflinks. Clara and Harold, in a corner, spoke in low tones, such as a young bride and groom might share, though Miss Marple noted the tension in Harold's posture, the way his hand gripped Clara's, as if anchoring himself. As the evening deepened, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier, the festive decorations now a mockery of the day's joy. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the details: Lionel's access to the tray, his history with Evelyn, the open garden door, the wax smear. Each was a piece of a puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. She thought of a case years ago in St. Mary Mead, where a spurned lover had slipped arsenic into a rival's tea. The motive, then, had been jealousy, but the method had required opportunity and a moment of distraction. Was Lionel's nervous fidgeting a sign of such a plan? Crane re-entered the parlor, his face grim. "The lab's rushing the tests," he announced to no one in particular. "We'll know soon if the poison was in the glass or the bottle, but I'll need statements from everyone who was near that tray." Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression serene, but her mind alight. A clever poisoner, Inspector, would ensure the poison touched only one glass, and they would know exactly where Miss Carver would sit. Crane's eyes narrowed. "You're pointing at Drake." "I'm pointing at nothing," she said softly. "But I wonder who knew the seating plan so well, and who might have had a vial small enough to conceal." The inspector grunted, his thoughts clearly aligning with hers. As he moved to question the next guest, Miss Marple settled back, her needles clicking once more. Lionel Drake, with his nervous hands and buried grudge, was a figure to watch. But she knew the truth often lay in the smallest details: the flick of a wrist, the shadow of a past slight, the gleam of a cufflink in the fading light. Chapter 4. The Bride's Secret. The evening shadows lengthened across the manicured lawns of Henshaw Manor, their dark fingers creeping through the tall windows of the grand hall, where the remnants of the wedding feast stood abandoned. The air, once vibrant with laughter and clinking glasses, now hung heavy with the weight of suspicion. The guests, still confined to the parlor under Inspector Crane's watchful eye, whispered in uneasy knots, their glances darting toward the closed doors of the study where interrogations continued. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner, her knitting needles moving with a deceptive calm, observed the scene with her usual acuity. Her thoughts, however, were drawn to Clara Winthrop, née Henshaw, the radiant bride whose composure seemed to mask a deeper unease. Clara, still in her ivory silk gown, sat beside Harold at the edge of the parlor, her delicate hands folded in her lap. Her face, framed by the soft curls of her veil, bore the serene expression expected of a new bride. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle signs of strain, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze flickered toward the hall where Evelyn Carver's body had been discreetly removed. There was something beneath that poise, Miss Marple thought, a thread of anxiety that tugged at the fabric of Clara's perfect demeanor. Inspector Crane, having concluded his questioning of Lionel Drake, now turned his attention to the bride. He invited Clara to the study, his manner polite but firm, and Miss Marple, with a nod from the inspector, followed as an observer. The study, with its heavy oak furniture and shelves of dusty tomes, seemed to close in around them, the atmosphere thick with unspoken questions. Clara took a seat, her posture erect, her hands smoothing the folds of her gown as if to steady herself. Miss Marple settled by the window, her knitting bag a silent companion, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. "Mrs. Winthrop," Crane began, his voice measured. "You were near the head table before the toast, weren't you? Adjusting the settings, I believe you said." Clara nodded, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that belied her inner tension. "Yes, Inspector. I was arranging the flowers and napkins, small details, you know, to ensure everything looked perfect. It's my day, after all." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Crane's pen hovered over his notebook. "And you didn't touch the champagne glasses? Not even Miss Carver's?" "No," Clara said firmly. "I was focused on the table's appearance, roses, place cards, that sort of thing. The tray was brought out by Mr. Drake and Mrs. Finch's assistant. I didn't go near it once it was set down." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her fingers, the way they pressed into the silk of her gown. The inspector leaned forward, his mustache twitching slightly. "You knew Miss Carver, didn't you? She was a colleague of your husband's from their Oxford days. Any reason she might have been a target?" Clara's composure faltered for a moment, her eyes flickering toward the floor. "I knew of her, Inspector. Harold mentioned her once or twice. They were rivals at university, competing for the same scholarship, I believe. But that was long ago. I can't imagine why anyone would want her dead." Her tone was earnest, but Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the careful choice of words. Clara was protecting something. Perhaps Harold, perhaps herself. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a conversation she had overheard at the village tea shop, where Mrs. Lavinia Price had spoken of Clara's devotion to Harold. "She's fiercely protective," Mrs. Price had said, her voice tinged with admiration. "Would do anything for that man, mark my words." Such loyalty, Miss Marple knew, could lead to desperate acts, especially if a threat loomed over a newly forged marriage. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young wife had concealed her husband's indiscretions, going so far as to mislead the police to shield him. Was Clara's composure a similar shield? Crane pressed further. "Miss Carver's presence at your wedding. Was it your idea to invite her?" Clara's eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise quickly masked. "No, not exactly. The guest list was mostly my doing, but Evelyn's name was added later. I believe Harold suggested it. Out of courtesy, I suppose, given their shared history." She paused, then added, "I didn't mind. It's a wedding, after all, a time for goodwill." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her hands remained still. Harold's suggestion to invite Evelyn was a detail worth noting. Why invite a known rival, unless to prove a point, or to set a stage? She made a mental note to probe Harold's motives later. For now, Clara's role intrigued her. The bride's proximity to the table, her access to the seating arrangements, and her protective nature suggested possibilities that could not be ignored. The inspector shifted tactics. "You were seen near the head table just before the toast, Mrs. Winthrop. A guest mentioned you adjusting a napkin near Miss Carver's place. Can you confirm that?" Clara's cheeks flushed faintly, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, I may have straightened a napkin or two, The table was my responsibility. I wanted everything perfect, but I didn't touch the glasses, Inspector. I swear it." Her eyes met his, wide and earnest, but Miss Marple noted the slight clench of her jaw, a sign of strain beneath the surface. Crane jotted a note, his expression unreadable. "And you noticed nothing unusual? No one lingering near the tray? No odd behavior?" Clara shook her head, her curls swaying gently. It was a busy moment. Guests were milling about. The staff were coming and going. I was focused on Harold, on the ceremony. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Her voice softened, a touch of vulnerability creeping in. "I just wanted this day to be perfect." Miss Marple, listening quietly, felt a pang of sympathy. Clara's desire for perfection was understandable, but it also provided a convenient veil. She recalled the wax smear she had noticed near Evelyn's place, a detail yet to be shared with Crane. Could Clara's adjustments to the table have concealed a more sinister act? The thought lingered, though Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Evidence, not supposition, would unravel this knot. As Crane dismissed Clara, Miss Marple rose and approached the inspector, her manner as unassuming as ever. "A word, Inspector?" she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. Crane turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Marple, you've something to add, I presume?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. "Only that Mrs. Winthrop is a devoted bride, Inspector. Such devotion can blind one to certain truths, or drive one to protect them at all costs. I wonder what she might know of her husband's past with Miss Carver." Crane's mustache twitched, a sign of his grudging respect. "You think she's covering for him?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm, "that a bride on her wedding day sees everything through the lens of love. And love, Inspector, can be a powerful motive, for good or ill." The inspector nodded, his gaze drifting to the parlor where Clara had rejoined Harold. "I'll speak to Mr. Winthrop next. If there's a history with Miss Carver, I'll find it." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the parlor. She slipped back into the room, taking a seat near Mrs. Lavinia Price, who was eager to share more gossip. "Clara's a sweet girl," Mrs. Price murmured, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. "But she's got a spine of steel when it comes to Harold. I heard Evelyn was stirring trouble again, something about an old scandal at Oxford. Clara wouldn't have stood for that, not on her wedding day." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of information. "Indeed, Mrs. Price, a bride's loyalty is a powerful thing. Did you hear anything specific about this scandal?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Only whispers, mind you. Evelyn claimed Harold cheated his way into that scholarship, something about a forged document. It never came to anything, but it hurt his reputation for a time. Clara was furious when she heard, or so the village says. The information was a thread in the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving. She thanked Mrs. Price and moved to the window, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond. The roses glowed in the fading light, but her thoughts were on the seating plan. Clara, as the bride, had overseen the arrangements, ensuring each guest was placed with care. Had she known Evelyn would sit at that precise spot? And if so, had she acted to protect her new life from a threat? As the evening deepened, the manor's atmosphere grew more oppressive, the festive decorations a cruel reminder of the day's joy. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Clara sat close to Harold, her hand resting on his, her face a mask of calm. But Miss Marple saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the study door. Harold, too, seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on some distant point. Crane re-entered the parlor, his face grim. "We've had word from the lab," he announced, quietly to Sergeant Baxter, though Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the words. "Traces of cyanide in Miss Carver's glass, and only hers. The bottle's clean, as are the other glasses." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. A single glass poisoned with such precision required not only access, but knowledge. Knowledge of where Evelyn would sit, knowledge of the moment when all eyes would be elsewhere. Clara's role in the table's arrangement, her proximity to the fatal glass, loomed large in her thoughts. Yet she knew the truth was never so simple. A bride, a best man, a caterer, a rival, each held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She rose, intending to take a discreet turn about the garden, hoping to inspect the side door Lionel had mentioned. As she passed Clara, she offered a gentle smile. "A trying day, my dear," she said softly. "You've borne it with great strength." Clara's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude mingling with something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she murmured. "I only wish it hadn't ended this way." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight. The bride's secret, whatever it was, lay buried beneath layers of loyalty and love. She would find it, as she always did, with patience and a keen eye for the frailties of the human heart. Chapter 5. The Caterer's Defense. The twilight had settled over Henshaw Manor, its soft purple hues seeping through the tall windows of the grand hall, where the remnants of the wedding feast lay untouched, a silent testament to the day's abrupt descent into tragedy. The air was heavy with the scent of wilting roses and the faint tang of spilled champagne, a stark contrast to the earlier festivity. The guests, still confined to the parlor under Inspector Crane's strict orders, had grown restless, their whispers now laced with fatigue and unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of quiet patience and piercing insight. Her thoughts were drawn to Mrs. Beatrice Finch, the caterer, whose flustered demeanor and defensive outbursts had piqued her curiosity. Mrs. Finch, a stout woman with a florid complexion and a no-nonsense air, had been bustling about the manor all day, her apron a badge of authority, as she directed her small army of assistants. Now, however, she stood near the service door, her hands wringing together, her eyes darting nervously as Inspector Crane summoned her to the study for questioning. Miss Marple, invited once more to sit in as an observer, followed quietly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The study, with its dark paneling and heavy air, seemed to close in around them, amplifying the tension in Mrs. Finch's rigid posture. Inspector Crane settled behind the desk, his weathered face set in a frown, his mustache bristling with purpose. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you were responsible for the champagne served during the toast. Can you walk me through the preparation?" Mrs. Finch drew herself up, her hands smoothing her apron as if to restore her dignity. "I've been in this business 30 years, Inspector," she said, her tone sharp with indignation. "My reputation is spotless. The champagne was from a reputable supplier, Barton & Sons, delivered yesterday, sealed and perfect. I opened the bottles myself in the kitchen just before the toast. My girls filled the glasses, and I oversaw every step. There was no poison in my champagne. I'll stake my life on it." Crane's pen scratched across his notebook, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And who had access to the tray before it reached the hall? Your staff, Mr. Drake, anyone else?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, her lips pursing as if weighing her words. "My assistant, Mary, filled the glasses. She's a good girl, reliable. Mr. Drake helped carry the tray out. He insisted, said it was part of his duties. No one else touched it, not that I saw. The kitchen was busy, mind you, staff coming and going, but I'd have noticed anything amiss." Her voice carried a note of defiance, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes, the way her hands clenched briefly before resuming their restless smoothing. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her hands remained still. She recalled a snippet of village gossip overheard at the post office where Mrs. Price had mentioned Mrs. Finch's recent troubles. "Lost a big contract to a rival firm," Mrs. Price had said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Backed by the Carver family, no less. Beatrice was livid, said it nearly ruined her." Such a loss, Miss Marple knew, could breed resentment, especially if Evelyn Carver's family had played a role. Was Mrs. Finch's agitation merely professional pride, or did it mask a deeper grudge? Crane leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "You're certain no one else approached the tray? No guests? No strangers?" Mrs. Finch's cheeks flushed, her voice rising. "I told you, Inspector, I was watching. The bottles were opened, the glasses filled, and the tray taken straight to the hall. If there was poison, it wasn't from my kitchen." She paused, then added, her voice softening slightly. "There was a side door to the garden, left open for ventilation. It's possible someone slipped in, but I didn't see it. I was too busy." Miss Marple's mind seized on this detail. The garden door, mentioned by Lionel Drake as well, was a point of vulnerability. An outsider, or an insider, could have used it to access the kitchen unnoticed. She made a mental note to inspect it, perhaps under the guise of a stroll through the roses. For now, her attention remained on Mrs. Finch, whose defensiveness seemed to teeter on the edge of panic. "And the glasses themselves?" Crane pressed. "Cleaned and inspected, you said. Any chance one was tampered with before the champagne was poured?" Mrs. Finch's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing. "My girls washed those glasses this morning, every one of them sparkling. I checked them myself before they were filled. If there was poison, it came after, not before." Her tone was adamant, but Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in her voice, a crack in her armor of certainty. The inspector jotted a note, his expression unreadable. "You knew Miss Carver, didn't you? Or at least her family?" Mrs. Finch's face tightened, her lips forming a thin line. "I knew of them," she admitted. "The Carvers are well known in the county. They've backed a rival firm, Harrington's Catering, over mine. Cost me a contract worth hundreds. But that's business, Inspector. I don't hold grudges." Her words were clipped, and Miss Marple sensed a lie in the denial. A woman whose livelihood was threatened might indeed harbor resentment, especially if Evelyn Carver had played a role in that loss. Crane shifted tactics. "You were in the hall before the toast, weren't you? Directing your staff, overseeing the service." "Yes," Mrs. Finch said, her voice steadying. "I was ensuring everything ran smoothly. The guests were seated, the tray was brought out, and Mr. Drake gave his speech. I was near the service door, keeping an eye on my girls." She paused, then added, "I saw Mrs. Winthrop adjusting the table settings, flowers, napkins, but she didn't touch the glasses, not that I noticed." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Clara's presence near the table, already noted, was confirmed, but Mrs. Finch's observation added a new layer. Had Clara's adjustments been as innocent as she claimed, or had they provided cover for a sleight of hand? And Mrs. Finch herself, her proximity to the tray, her control over the kitchen, made her a figure worth watching. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a cook had poisoned a guest's pudding to settle a score over a stolen recipe. The motive had been petty, but the method deadly. Could Mrs. Finch's financial grudge have driven her to a similar act? Crane dismissed Mrs. Finch with a curt nod, instructing her to remain in the parlor. As she exited, her shoulders stiff with indignation, Miss Marple rose and approached the inspector. "A word, Inspector?" she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of quiet authority. Crane turned, his mustache twitching with a mix of curiosity and exasperation. "Miss Marple, you've something to share, I take it?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. "Only that Mrs. Finch is a proud woman, Inspector. A blow to her business is a blow to her pride. And pride, you know, can lead to desperate acts. That open garden door is curious, don't you think?" Crane's eyes narrowed. "You think someone slipped in?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm, "that an open door is an invitation, and Mrs. Finch, for all her bluster, may know more than she's saying." The inspector nodded, his gaze drifting to the service door. "We'll check that door, and I've asked Baxter to question the staff about any strangers in the kitchen. If someone got in, we'll find out." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the garden. She excused herself and slipped into the hall, where the tray of glasses still rested on the sideboard, now under Sergeant Baxter's watchful eye. She paused, her eyes scanning the table where Evelyn had sat. The wax smear she had noticed earlier was still there, a faint mark that suggested a vial or container. She resolved to mention it to Crane, but first she wanted to see the garden door for herself. Stepping outside, she made her way to the rose garden, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, as if against the evening chill. The side door, tucked behind a trellis of climbing roses, was indeed ajar, its latch worn and loose. She examined it closely, noting a scuff mark on the threshold, as if something had been dragged across it. A vial, perhaps, dropped in haste. She bent down, her fingers brushing the ground, and found a tiny shred of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, caught in the grass. It bore a faint chemical smell, sharp and acrid. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind racing. Returning to the parlor, she found Mrs. Finch conferring with her assistant, Mary, her voice low but urgent. "You're sure no one was in the kitchen?" Mrs. Finch was saying, her tone sharp. Mary nodded, her face pale, but Miss Marple caught the girl's quick glance toward the garden door. Another thread, she thought, to be woven into the tapestry. She took her seat, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Mrs. Finch, now seated with the other guests, seemed to regain some of her composure, but her hands still twisted in her lap. Clara and Harold sat close, their heads bent together, while Lionel paced near the window, his cufflinks glinting with each turn. The lab's findings, Miss Marple knew, had confirmed cyanide in Evelyn's glass alone, a fact that pointed to a deliberate act. Mrs. Finch's control over the kitchen, her access to the tray, and her possible grudge against the Carver family made her a figure of interest. But the open door suggested other possibilities. Someone slipping in, someone with a plan. As the night deepened, the manor's atmosphere grew more oppressive, the festive decorations a cruel mockery of the day's joy. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the details: the wax smear, the scuff mark, the shred of paper, Mrs. Finch's defensiveness. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of a village grocer who had once tampered with a rival's goods, driven by a petty feud. Mrs. Finch's loss was far from petty, but was it enough to drive her to murder? Crane re-entered, his face grim. "The door's being examined," he said quietly to Baxter, "and we're checking the supplier's records for the champagne. If there's a lead, we'll find it." Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression serene, but her mind alight. "A clever poisoner, Inspector, would choose their moment carefully, and an open door, you know, is as good as an invitation." Crane grunted, his thoughts aligning with hers. As he moved to question the next guest, Miss Marple settled back, her needles clicking softly. Mrs. Finch, with her pride and her opportunity, was a thread to follow. But the truth, she knew, lay in the small details: the mark on a threshold, the scent on a scrap of paper, the shadow of a grudge cast across a perfect day. Chapter 6. The Rival's Shadow. The night had draped Henshaw Manor in a velvet shroud, its darkness broken only by the flickering glow of lamps within the grand hall. The once vibrant wedding reception, now a scene of grim investigation, lay silent, the tables cluttered with abandoned glasses and wilting flowers. The guests, still confined to the parlor under Inspector Crane's orders, had settled into a restless quiet, their earlier whispers giving way to strained silence. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner, her knitting needles tracing their steady rhythm, observed the room with her characteristic clarity. Her thoughts were drawn to Evelyn Carver, the victim, whose presence at the wedding had cast a shadow far longer than her brief appearance might suggest. Evelyn, with her auburn hair and sharp intellect, had been a figure of intensity, a barrister whose ambition matched her ruthlessness. Miss Marple, piecing together fragments of village gossip and her own observations, sensed that Evelyn's death was no random act, but the culmination of a grudge rooted in her past. The question was whose grudge, and why now, on this day of celebration? As Inspector Crane continued his interrogations in the study, Miss Marple's mind turned to the rivalries that had defined Evelyn's life, particularly her contentious history with Harold Winthrop, the groom. Crane had summoned Harold to the study, and Miss Marple, with her quiet authority, was permitted to sit in as an observer. The room, with its heavy oak shelves and dim lighting, seemed to press in on Harold as he took a seat, his tailored suit now slightly rumpled, his dark hair falling across his forehead. His face, handsome but strained, bore the weight of the day's events, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hands clasped tightly together, as if anchoring himself against the inspector's scrutiny. "Mr. Winthrop," Crane began, his voice steady but probing, "you and Miss Carver were at Oxford together, weren't you? Rivals, I understand, for a prestigious scholarship?" Harold nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes, Inspector, the Haverford Scholarship. It was a competitive time, but I won it fairly. Evelyn didn't take it well." His tone was measured, But Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, a shadow of something unspoken. Crane's pen hovered over his notebook. "She accused you of cheating, didn't she? Spread rumors about a forged document?" Harold's fingers tightened, his knuckles whitening. "That was nonsense," he said sharply. "Evelyn was bitter. She couldn't accept losing. She claimed I'd plagiarized a brief, but there was no proof. The matter was dropped, and I thought it was behind us." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Until today." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her hands remained still. She recalled Mrs. Lavinia Price's gossip at the tea shop, where she had spoken of Evelyn's vendetta against Harold. "She never forgave him," Mrs. Price had whispered, her eyes gleaming. "Said he'd stolen her chance at greatness." Such a slight, Miss Marple knew, could fester, but it also raised a question. Had Evelyn come to the wedding to reopen old wounds, or had someone invited her to ensure they were closed forever? Crane leaned forward, his mustache twitching. "Why was Miss Carver here, Mr. Winthrop? A rival from your past at your wedding. Seems an odd choice for a guest." Harold hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door as if seeking Clara's presence. "I suggested inviting her," he admitted. "Clara was handling the guest list, but I thought it would be a gesture of goodwill. We'd both moved on, or so I believed. I didn't want bad blood." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands, a sign of strain beneath his polished exterior. "And you noticed nothing unusual about her behavior today?" Crane pressed. "No threats? No hints of trouble?" Harold shook his head. "She congratulated us, that's all. She seemed herself. Confident? Sharp? I didn't think anything of it until—" His voice trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window. Miss Marple's mind raced. Harold's decision to invite Evelyn was curious, a gesture that seemed less about goodwill and more about control. Perhaps a way to prove he had risen above her accusations. Or had it been a trap, orchestrated by someone else? She recalled the half-written letter found among Evelyn's belongings, discovered by Sergeant Baxter during a search of her room. The letter, addressed to no one, had hinted at a revelation. Evelyn planned to share at the wedding. Its tone was cryptic, almost menacing, and Miss Marple wondered if it had been the spark that ignited a murderer's resolve. Crane shifted tactics. "You were near the head table before the toast, weren't you? Did you see anyone tampering with the glasses?" Harold's brow furrowed, as if replaying the moment. "I was with Clara, mostly. The room was crowded, guests moving about, staff bustling. I saw Lionel bring out the tray, and Mrs. Finch was directing her. Girls. Clara adjusted some flowers, but I didn't notice anything odd." He paused, then added, "Evelyn was at her seat early, though. She seemed expectant, almost." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Expectant. The word lingered in her mind, conjuring images of a woman poised to stir trouble. Had Evelyn's revelation been aimed at Harold, threatening to unravel his carefully built reputation? Or had it been a broader threat, one that implicated another? She made a mental note to examine the letter more closely, if Crane would permit it. The inspector dismissed Harold with a curt nod, instructing him to remain in the parlor. As he exited, his shoulders slightly hunched, Miss Marple rose and approached Crane. "A word, Inspector?" she said, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet weight. Crane turned, his expression a mix of respect and mild impatience. "Miss Marple, you've something to add, I presume?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. Only that Mr. Winthrop's decision to invite Miss Carver is intriguing, don't you think? A rival from the past, brought into the heart of his new life. It suggests either great confidence or great fear. Crane's mustache twitched. You think he had reason to silence her? I think, Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm, that old rivalries cast long shadows, and Miss Carver's letter suggests she came with a purpose. I wonder who else knew of it. The inspector nodded, his gaze drifting to the parlor. We'll look at that letter again, and I'll have Baxter check the guest list, who suggested what and when. Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the parlor. She slipped back into the room, taking a seat near Mrs. Lavinia Price, whose appetite for gossip was undiminished by the hour. Harold's looking shaken, Mrs. Price murmured, leaning close. And no wonder, with Evelyn here. She was always trouble, that one. I heard she was planning to say something at the reception, something to embarrass him, mark my words. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of information. Indeed, Mrs. Price. Did you hear what she might have planned? Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed. Only whispers, but enough. She was seen writing something at the inn last night. A letter, they say, full of venom. Said she'd expose a secret that would ruin someone. Harold, I'd wager, given their history. The information was a thread in the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving. She thanked Mrs. Price and moved to the window, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond, where the roses glowed faintly in the moonlight. The letter, she thought, was the key. Its contents, though vague, suggested a motive for murder, not just for Harold, but for anyone threatened by Evelyn's revelation. Clara, protective of her new husband, might have acted to shield him. Lionel, nursing an old wound, could have seen an opportunity. Even Mrs. Finch, with her business grievances, might have feared exposure of some kind. Miss Marple resolved to see the letter herself. She approached Sergeant Baxter, who was guarding the parlor door, and with her gentle charm persuaded him to let her glance at the evidence bag containing Evelyn's belongings. The letter, written in Evelyn's precise hand, was indeed cryptic. Tomorrow, I will set things right. The truth must be told, no matter the cost. It was unsigned, addressed to no one, but its intent was clear. Miss Marple's mind turned to the seating plan, the tray, the moment of the toast. Someone had known Evelyn would drink from that glass, someone who feared her words. As the night deepened, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier, the festive decorations a cruel reminder of the day's joy. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Harold sat with Clara, his hand gripping hers, his face a mask of controlled tension. Lionel paced near the window, his cufflinks glinting, while Mrs. Finch whispered urgently to her assistant. The lab's findings, cyanide in Evelyn's glass alone, pointed to a deliberate act, one that required knowledge and opportunity. Evelyn's shadow, cast by her past rivalries, loomed over them all. Crane re-entered, his face grim. The letter's being analyzed for fingerprints, he said quietly to Baxter. And we're checking the inn where Miss Carver stayed. Any visitors, any calls. Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression serene, but her mind alight. A clever poisoner, Inspector, would know their target's habits, and a woman like Miss Carver, with enemies in her past, might have provoked more than one. Crane grunted, his thoughts aligning with hers. As he moved to question the next guest, Miss Marple settled back, her needles clicking softly. Evelyn's shadow was long, but the truth, she knew, lay in the details. The half-written letter, the precise placement of a glass, the motive hidden in a rival's heart. Chapter 7. The Clue in the Glass. The moon hung low over Henshaw Manor, its pale light filtering through the tall, mullioned windows of the grand hall, casting eerie patterns across the abandoned tables. The remnants of the wedding feast, half-eaten canapes, wilting roses, and forgotten champagne flutes, stood as silent witnesses to the tragedy that had shattered the day's joy. The guests, now weary and subdued in the parlor, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the study where Inspector Crane's investigation pressed on relentlessly. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner near a window overlooking the rose garden, her knitting needles tracing their steady rhythm, observed the room with a clarity undimmed by the late hour. Her thoughts were fixed on the shattered glass that had held Evelyn Carver's fatal sip, a fragile clue that held the key to the murderer's method. Inspector Crane, his weathered face etched with determination, had turned his attention to the physical evidence. The forensic expert, Dr. Willis, a brisk young man with a no-nonsense air, had arrived from the county laboratory, his black bag bristling with tools. In the study, where Miss Marple was permitted to observe, Dr. Willis knelt beside the spot where Evelyn had fallen, his gloved hands carefully collecting the shards of her broken champagne flute. "Cyanide, no doubt about it," he confirmed, his voice clipped as he addressed Crane. "The lab results are unequivocal. Traces in the glass, none in the bottle or the other flutes. It was targeted, Inspector. Someone meant for her alone to drink it." Crane's mustache twitched, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the implications. "No fingerprints, you said?" Dr. Willis shook his head, sealing the shards in an evidence bag with precise movements. "None but Miss Carver's. The glass was clean. Too clean, if you ask me. Whoever did this knew to avoid leaving marks. The cyanide was likely a liquid, added directly to the glass. A small dose, but lethal within seconds." Miss Marple's needles paused, her hands still as her mind sifted through the details. A glass wiped clean of fingerprints, save for Evelyn's, suggested a meticulous hand, one that had planned not just the act, but its concealment. She recalled the moment of the toast. Lionel Drake raising his flute, his nervous voice ringing out, the guests echoing his words, the brief chaos of clinking glasses and murmured congratulations. In that fleeting distraction, a practiced hand could have slipped a vial's contents into Evelyn's glass. But who had the knowledge, the access, and the nerve? The seating plan, she thought, was key. Someone had known exactly where Evelyn would sit. Crane turned to Sergeant Baxter, who stood by the door, his notebook at the ready. The tray was handled by Drake, Mrs. Finch, and her assistant, Mary. Mrs. Winthrop was near the table, adjusting things. Anyone else? Baxter shook his head, his young face earnest. "Not that we've found, sir. The staff swear no one else approached the tray once it was set down. But that garden door Mrs. Finch mentioned, it's a weak point. Anyone could have slipped in from outside." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. The garden door, which she had inspected earlier, was indeed a vulnerability, its loose latch and scuff-marked threshold hinting at a hasty passage. She thought of the shred of paper she had found, tucked into her handkerchief, its acrid scent suggesting a chemical residue, perhaps part of a vial's label, discarded in a moment of panic. And then there was the tiny glass fragment she had discovered in the roses, its curved edge hinting at a container small enough to conceal. These were threads in the tapestry she was weaving, and she resolved to share them with Crane. Excusing herself from the study, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, her shawl drawn about her shoulders as if against the night's chill. The rose garden, bathed in moonlight, was a study in contrasts, beauty masking potential danger. She approached the side door, its frame partially hidden by a trellis of climbing roses, and examined the ground more closely. Her fingers brushed the grass, and there, caught in a thorn, was another fragment. A sliver of glass, barely larger than a pea, with a faint curve that matched the one she had found earlier. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief, her mind racing. A vial, small enough to slip into a pocket or palm, could have held the cyanide, introduced in the kitchen or the hall during the bustle of the reception. Returning to the manor, she found Crane in the hall, conferring with Dr. Willis. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "I've found something you might wish to see." She produced the handkerchief, revealing the paper scrap and the 2 glass fragments. "Near the garden door, caught in the roses. They may be nothing, but the scent on the paper is curious, and the glass suggests a container." Crane's eyes narrowed as he took the items, passing them to Dr. Willis. "Test these," he instructed. "If there's cyanide residue, we've got a delivery method." Dr. Willis nodded, his expression grim. "Could be from a vial, all right. I'll rush the analysis, should have results by morning." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the tray. She approached the sideboard where it rested, now under Baxter's watchful eye. The remaining glasses, their contents untouched since the toast, gleamed in the lamplight. She noted their arrangement. Evelyn's place marked by an empty space where her glass had shattered. The precision of the poisoning suggested intimate knowledge of the seating plan, a detail that implicated those closest to the event's organization. Clara, who had arranged the tables, Lionel, who had carried the tray, Mrs. Finch, who had overseen the service. But the clean glass, free of fingerprints, pointed to a careful hand, one that had planned for scrutiny. Back in the parlor, Miss Marple took her seat, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. The guests were growing weary, their faces drawn with the strain of the long night. Clara sat close to Harold, her hand resting on his, her composure a delicate mask that seemed to falter under the weight of the hour. Lionel paced near the window, his cufflinks glinting with each turn, his nervous energy a constant presence. Mrs. Finch, now seated with her assistant, Mary whispered urgently, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on each, her mind weaving a tapestry of motives and opportunities. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned cordial had been traced to a vial hidden in a garden shed. The culprit, a jilted suitor, had used the chaos of a village fete to slip the poison into a glass, wiping it clean to avoid detection. The parallel was striking, but the method here was more precise, the target unmistakable. Evelyn's glass, clean of fingerprints save her own, suggested a meticulous hand, one that knew how to act without being seen. The vial fragments, if confirmed to contain cyanide, would narrow the field, pointing to someone with access to both the poison and the opportunity to use it. Mrs. Lavinia Price, ever eager to share gossip, beckoned Miss Marple over. "Dreadful business," she murmured, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. "That glass, they say it was poisoned just for Evelyn. Someone must have known her every move. I heard she was planning to stir up trouble. something about Harold's past or maybe Lionel's. She always had a way of making enemies. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of information. Indeed, Mrs. Price, a woman like Miss Carver would have provoked strong feelings. Did you hear anything specific about her intentions? Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Only that she was seen at the inn, writing that letter, said it would set things right. I reckon she meant to shame someone. Harold, most likely, given their history. But who'd go so far as to kill her? The question echoed in Miss Marple's mind, unanswered but heavy with implication. She thanked Mrs. Price and returned to her thoughts, her needles clicking softly. The letter, with its cryptic promise of revelation, was a spark that could have ignited any number of motives. Harold, fearing exposure of an old scandal. Clara, protecting her new husband. Lionel, nursing a long-buried grudge. Mrs. Finch, stung by a business slight. Each had reason to silence Evelyn. But the glass, the vial, the garden door, these were the threads that would lead to the truth. Crane re-entered the parlor, his face grim. The labs confirmed cyanide in the glass shards, he said quietly to Baxter, though Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the words. And they're testing the fragments Miss Marple found. If they match, we've got a delivery method. Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression serene, but her mind alight. A clever poisoner, Inspector, would choose their moment carefully, she said softly. And a glass wiped clean suggests a hand that knew it would be examined. Crane grunted, his thoughts aligning with hers. We're checking the staff's backgrounds for any access to cyanide, chemists, laboratories, even garden supplies. And that door's being dusted for prints. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the village chemist Mr. Hodges, who was known to stock such substances for legitimate purposes. She recalled a case where a gardener had misused cyanide meant for pest control, a mistake that had turned deadly. Could someone at the manor have acquired such a poison, perhaps under a pretext? The vial fragments, if confirmed, would be a crucial link. As the night wore on, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier, the festive decorations a cruel mockery of the day's joy. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the details, the clean glass, the vial fragments, the open door, the seating plan. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of a village seamstress who had once hidden a theft in plain sight, using a distraction to slip a stolen brooch into her pocket. The poisoner here, she suspected, had used a similar sleight of hand, cloaked in the chaos of the toast. Crane moved to question the next guest, his stride purposeful. Miss Marple settled back, her needles clicking softly. The clue in the glass was a beacon, pointing to a careful, calculating mind. But whose? The answer, she knew, lay in the small details, the glint of a cufflink, the tremor of a hand, the shadow of a motive cast across a shattered glass. Chapter 8. The Motive Unraveled. The night had deepened over Henshaw Manor, its heavy silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the low murmur of the guests in the parlor. The grand hall, once aglow with the warmth of celebration, now lay in shadow, its chandeliers dimmed, casting a somber pall over the abandoned tables. The air carried a faint chill, as if the tragedy of Evelyn Carver's death had seeped into the very walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady, almost meditative rhythm, observed the room with her characteristic clarity. Her thoughts were fixed on the web of motives that entangled the suspects. Lionel Drake, Clara Winthrop, Harold Winthrop, and Mrs. Beatrice Finch, each bound by their own secrets to the poisoned glass that had claimed Evelyn's life. Inspector Crane, his weathered face set in a determined frown, had gathered the principal suspects in the Manor's library, a room of towering bookshelves and heavy velvet drapes that seemed to absorb the light. The decision to bring them together was a calculated one, inspired by Miss Marple's suggestion that observing their reactions in close proximity might reveal a crack in their carefully constructed facades. She sat near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her side, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. The suspects, seated in a semicircle, eyed each other warily. Lionel, his lanky frame hunched, his fingers fidgeting with his silver cufflinks. Clara, her ivory gown now slightly creased, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Harold, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the door. And Mrs. Finch, her stout figure rigid, her lips pursed in defiance. Crane stood before them, his notebook tucked under his arm, his mustache bristling with authority. "We know now that Miss Carver was poisoned with cyanide, delivered in her champagne glass alone," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of accusation. The bottle was clean, the other glasses untouched. Someone in this room, or someone with access to that tray, knew exactly where. She would sit and acted with precision. "I want answers, and I want them now." The room grew taut, the silence broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Lionel's pallor deepened, his fingers rubbing his cufflinks with a nervous intensity. Clara's composure held, but her eyes flickered toward Harold, a silent question in their depths. Harold's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening, while Mrs. Finch's breath came in short, sharp bursts, her indignation barely contained. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Miss Carver's death was no accident," she said, her tone deceptively gentle. "The cyanide was in her glass, and only her glass. Someone knew she would drink from it, and someone had a reason to ensure she never spoke again." Her eyes moved from one suspect to the next, lingering on each as if peeling back layers of pretense. Lionel shifted uncomfortably, his voice breaking the silence. "I've told you, Inspector, I only carried the tray. I didn't touch her glass." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted toward the door, as if seeking escape. She recalled the village gossip about his humiliation at Evelyn's hands, a rejection that had left scars. Was it enough to drive him to murder? Crane turned to Harold, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Winthrop, you admitted Miss Carver was a rival from your Oxford days. She accused you of cheating, didn't she? And that letter we found, her revelation, was it aimed at you?" Harold's jaw tightened, his voice low but steady. "Evelyn was always stirring trouble. Yes, she accused me of plagiarizing a brief, but it was baseless. The letter, I don't know what she meant to say. I invited her to show there was no bad blood." His eyes met Clara's briefly, and Miss Marple caught the flash of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead, whose career had nearly been derailed by a rival's slander. The shame had lingered, and Harold's guarded demeanor suggested a similar wound. Clara, sensing the focus on her husband, spoke up, her voice clear but tinged with emotion. "Harold had no reason to harm her, Inspector. We wanted a fresh start, a happy day. Evelyn was a guest, nothing more." Her hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the protective edge in her tone. A bride's loyalty, she knew, could be a powerful force, capable of shielding or concealing a multitude of sins. Mrs. Finch, unable to contain herself, bristled. "And what about me? You're not suggesting I'd ruin my own reputation with poison. The Carvers cost me a contract, yes, but I'm a professional, not a murderer." Her voice rose, her cheeks flushing, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. The open garden door, the scuff mark, the vile fragments. Mrs. Finch's kitchen had been the stage for the crime's preparation, whether she admitted it or not. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Mr. Winthrop, you knew of Miss Carver's letter, didn't you? A revelation that could have harmed you, perhaps?" Her eyes locked on Harold, who stiffened, his hands clenching tighter. "I heard rumors," he admitted, his voice strained. "She was at the inn, talking about setting things right. I thought it was just her usual dramatics." His gaze dropped, and Miss Marple sensed a half-truth. The letter, with its cryptic promise, had clearly unnerved him. Turning to Lionel, she continued, "And Mr. Drake, you loved Miss Carver once, didn't you? A rejection like that, so public, so cruel. It lingers, doesn't it?" Her tone was gentle, almost sympathetic, but her eyes were sharp, noting the flush that crept up Lionel's neck. "That was years ago," he stammered, his fingers rubbing his cufflinks furiously. "I'd moved on. I wouldn't." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw the crack in his defenses, the raw edge of an old wound. To Mrs. Finch, she said, "And you, Mrs. Finch, your business suffered because of the Carvers. A small vial in the garden near your kitchen door. Convenient, don't you think?" Her words were soft, but they landed like stones, and Mrs. Finch's face reddened, her protests loud but unconvincing. Crane watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing as he followed Miss Marple's lead. "We've got evidence," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "A vial fragment found in the garden with traces of cyanide. Someone brought that poison here, and someone slipped it into Miss Carver's glass. Who?" The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation pressing down on them all. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of emotions. She had planted the seeds, and now she watched for the harvest. Lionel's hands trembled, Clara's eyes flickered with fear, Harold's jaw tightened, and Mrs. Finch's breath came in short gasps. Each, she knew, held a piece of the truth, but only one held the key. Crane seized the moment. "We're testing the vial fragments for fingerprints," he said, his gaze sweeping the group. "And we're checking the seating plan, the guest list, every detail. Someone in this room knows more than they're saying." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight. The letter, the vial, the clean glass. These were the clues that pointed to a motive rooted in the past. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a betrayed friend had used a public event to exact revenge, slipping poison into a rival's drink under the guise of festivity. The method here was similar, but the precision suggested a deeper intent, a grudge that had simmered for years. As the suspects were dismissed, their faces a study in unease, Miss Marple remained in the library, her thoughts turning to the seating plan. Clara had arranged it, but Harold had suggested Evelyn's inclusion. Lionel had carried the tray, and Mrs. Finch had controlled the kitchen. Each had opportunity, but the motive, the spark that had ignited this deadly act, lay in Evelyn's past, in the shadows she had cast. Crane approached her, his face grim. "You've stirred them up, Miss Marple. Think one of them will crack?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People reveal themselves, Inspector, when pressed. A motive unraveled is like a thread pulled from a tapestry. It reveals the pattern beneath." He grunted, his thoughts aligned with hers. "We'll watch them closely. The lab's results should give us more by morning." Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles clicking softly. The motive was unraveling, but the truth remained just out of reach. She thought of the letter. The truth must be told, no matter the cost. And the vile fragments, silent witnesses to a calculated act. The answer, she knew, lay in the small details, the flicker of fear, the weight of a grudge, the shadow of a rival's ambition. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow through the tall windows of Henshaw Manor. The grand hall, still bearing the remnants of the ill-fated wedding feast, lay in a state of eerie stillness, its tables cluttered with abandoned glasses and wilting flowers. The air was thick with the scent of stale champagne and the lingering weight of tragedy. The guests, confined to the parlor through the long night, had grown listless, their faces drawn with exhaustion and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, observed the room with undiminished clarity. Her thoughts were fixed on the delicate web of clues, the vile fragments, the clean glass, the cryptic letter, that pointed to a calculated act of murder. Today, she resolved, the trap would be set to catch the killer. Inspector Crane, his weathered face etched with the strain of a sleepless night, had convened a meeting in the Manor's library, where the suspects, Lionel Drake, Clara Winthrop, Harold Winthrop, and Mrs. Beatrice Finch, awaited. The room, with its towering bookshelves and heavy drapes, seemed to pulse with tension, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the suspects' faces. Miss Marple, invited to observe, took her seat near the fireplace, her knitting bag a silent companion. Her suggestion to reenact the moment of the toast had been met with reluctant agreement from Crane, who saw the value in testing the suspect's reactions under pressure. "The poison was in Miss Carver's glass alone," Crane began, his voice steady but carrying a note of challenge. "Someone in this room, or someone with access to the tray, slipped cyanide into her champagne. We're going to recreate the moment of the toast, exactly, as it happened. I want to see every movement, every gesture. If anyone hesitates, I'll know why." His mustache twitched, his eyes sweeping the group. Lionel, his lanky frame hunched, rubbed his silver cufflinks nervously, his hazel eyes darting toward the door. Clara, her ivory gown now faintly crumpled, sat with her hands folded tightly, her composure a fragile veneer. Harold, beside her, gripped her hand, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on some distant point. Mrs. Finch, her stout figure rigid, bristled with indignation, her lips pursed as if ready to protest. Miss Marple's needles paused, her sharp eyes noting each reaction, the flicker of fear, the tightening of a jaw, the restless fidgeting of hands. The reenactment was to take place in the grand hall, where the head table had been left untouched, save for the removal of Evelyn's shattered glass. The tray, now empty, rested on the sideboard, its remaining glasses carefully preserved for evidence. Crane directed the suspects to their positions, Lionel at the head of the table, preparing to deliver the toast, Clara near the table's edge, adjusting the flowers as she had done, Mrs. Finch by the service door, overseeing her assistant, Mary, who carried a replica tray, and Harold seated as he had been, near Clara. The other guests, permitted to watch from the parlor doorway, murmured softly, their curiosity tinged with unease. Miss Marple positioned herself near the sideboard, her knitting bag at her side, her view unobstructed. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a reenactment of a village pageant had exposed a thief's sleight of hand, revealed in the nervous repetition of a gesture. Here, she suspected, the killer's habits would betray them. A glance, a hesitation, a movement too practiced or too cautious. Crane nodded to Lionel. "Mr. Drake, begin. Raise the glass. Give the toast, just as you did yesterday." Lionel, his face pale, lifted a glass from the tray, his hands trembling slightly. "To love, to trust, to a future bright," he said, his voice faltering, lacking the forced cheer of the original moment. The guests, standing in for their counterparts, raised imaginary glasses, their movements stiff. Miss Marple's eyes followed Lionel's hands, noting the way his fingers lingered on the cufflinks, the same nervous tick she had observed throughout the investigation. As he set the glass down, he stumbled slightly, the tray wobbling on the table, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting movement, a quick flick of his wrist, as if practicing a sleight of hand. Clara, at the table's edge, adjusted a napkin near where Evelyn's place had been, her movements deliberate but slightly hurried. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers brushed the table, pausing near the spot where the wax smear had been found. Was it a reflex or a conscious act to cover a past deed? Harold, seated nearby, watched her closely, his expression unreadable, but his grip on the chair's arm tightening. Mrs. Finch, stationed by the service door, barked instructions to Mary, her voice sharp but her eyes darting toward the tray, as if fearful of what it might reveal. Crane, his gaze as sharp as Miss Marple's, paced the hall, his notebook open. "Mrs. Winthrop, you were here, adjusting the table. Show me exactly what you did." Clara complied, her hands smoothing a napkin, rearranging a rose. "It was just this," she said softly, her voice steady, but her eyes flickering toward Harold. "I wanted everything perfect." Miss Marple noted the precision of her movements, the way her fingers lingered near the empty space where Evelyn's glass had stood. A practiced gesture, perhaps, or an innocent one. Turning to Mrs. Finch, Crane said, "You were overseeing the tray's delivery. Where were you standing when Mr. Drake brought it out?" Mrs. Finch pointed to the service door, her posture defensive. "Right here, Inspector. I was watching my girls, making sure everything went smoothly. I didn't touch the glasses after they were filled." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided the tray. Crane nodded to Mary, who carried the replica tray to the table, mimicking her actions from the previous day. The girl's hands shook, and Miss Marple saw her glance nervously toward Mrs. Finch, as if seeking reassurance. The garden door, still ajar, caught Miss Marple's eye, its loose latch a silent reminder of the vile fragments found nearby. As the reenactment concluded, Crane stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Someone in this room used that moment, the chaos of the toast, to slip cyanide into Miss Carver's glass. The vile fragments we found confirm it. Who had the means, and who had the motive?" Lionel's face flushed, his fingers rubbing his cufflinks with renewed vigor. "I didn't do it," he protested, his voice cracking. "I carried the tray, that's all." But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to his cufflinks, where a faint scratch, barely visible, gleamed in the lamplight. A mark, she thought, from handling a vial. She recalled the glass fragment caught in the roses, its curve matching a small container, one that could be concealed in a palm or caught on a cufflink in a moment of haste. Clara's composure wavered, her hands trembling as she adjusted her veil. Harold's gaze was fixed on Lionel, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Mrs. Finch, her indignation faltering, glanced toward the garden door, as if fearing what it might reveal. Miss Marple whispered to Crane, her voice low. "Inspector, Mr. Drake's cufflinks. There's a scratch. It may be nothing, but it's worth a look." Crane nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Drake, step forward. Let's see those cufflinks." Lionel froze, his hands dropping to his sides. "They're just cufflinks," he stammered, but his voice betrayed panic. Crane, with a swift motion, took his wrist examining the silver. The scratch, faint but distinct, ran across the engraved initials. "Interesting," Crane said, his tone heavy with implication. "Care to explain this?" Lionel's face drained of color. "It's nothing, a scratch from my watch, that's all." But his eyes darted toward the door, and Miss Marple saw the crack in his defenses widen. Crane turned to the group, his voice firm. "We're testing those vial fragments for fingerprints and residue, and we're examining every detail, cufflinks, napkins, everything. Someone slipped that poison into Miss Carver's glass, and we're close to finding out who." The suspects dispersed, their faces a study in unease. Miss Marple remained in the hall, her thoughts turning to the reenactment. Lionel's stumble, his quick wrist movement, suggested a practiced act, one he might have performed in the chaos of the toast. Clara's lingering hands, Mrs. Finch's nervous glances, Harold's tense silence, each added a thread to the tapestry. But Lionel's cufflinks were a beacon. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a pickpocket's nervous habit had betrayed him during a village fair. The killer here, she suspected, had a similar tell, a gesture honed by intent, revealed under pressure. The vial fragments, the scratch, the letter's threat, these were the clues that would spring the trap. Crane approached her, his face grim. "You've got a nose for this, Miss Marple. That scratch, think it's from the vial?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "A small mark, Inspector, can tell a large story. Mr. Drake's nerves are telling, don't you think?" Crane grunted, his thoughts aligning with hers. "We'll have the lab check those cufflinks. If there's residue, we've got him." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. The trap was set, and the killer, she knew, was close to stumbling. The truth lay in the details, the flicker of a wrist, the scratch on a cufflink, the motive hidden in a moment of distraction. Chapter 10. The Confession. The first rays of dawn had given way to a pale, overcast morning, casting a muted light through the tall windows of Henshaw Manor. The grand hall, still littered with the remnants of the ill-fated wedding feast, seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the final unraveling of the tragedy that had stained its polished floors. The guests, confined to the parlor through the long night, were now silent, their exhaustion mingling with a tense anticipation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, observed the room with a clarity sharpened by the weight of the moment. Her thoughts were fixed on the reenactment of the toast, where Lionel Drake's nervous stumble and the telltale scratch on his cufflink had set the stage for the truth to emerge. Inspector Crane, his weathered face set in a grim resolve, had reconvened the principal suspects, Lionel Drake, Clara Winthrop, Harold Winthrop, and Mrs. Beatrice Finch, in the Manor's library. The room, with its towering bookshelves and heavy velvet drapes, seemed to close in around them, amplifying the tension that hung like a storm cloud. Miss Marple, invited to observe, took her seat near the fireplace, her knitting bag a silent companion, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. The vile fragments, the clean glass, the cryptic letter, and now the scratched cufflink had woven a web that pointed unmistakably to one figure, and she sensed the moment of reckoning was near. Crane stood before the group, his notebook tucked under his arm, his mustache bristling with authority. "We've got new evidence," he announced, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The vile fragments from the garden tested positive for cyanide residue. And Mr. Drake, that scratch on your cufflink, the lab found traces of the same residue. Care to explain? Lionel's face drained of color, his lanky frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the accusation. His fingers, which had been rubbing the silver cufflinks compulsively, froze, and his hazel eyes darted toward the door, as if seeking an escape that did not exist. It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The scratch, it's from my watch, I told you. I wouldn't." Miss Marple's needles paused, her sharp eyes fixed on Lionel. She noted the panic in his voice, the way his hands trembled, betraying more than his words. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's nervous habit, a constant tugging at his collar, had revealed his guilt in a theft. Lionel's cufflinks, with their telltale scratch, were a similar beacon, and the reenactment had exposed a gesture too practiced to be innocent. Crane stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "You carried the tray, Mr. Drake. You were in the kitchen, near the garden door. You had access to the glass, and you had a history with Miss Carver. That letter she wrote, setting things right, was it about you? Did she threaten to expose something?" Lionel's breath came in short, ragged gasps, his eyes wide with fear. "No. Yes, she humiliated me, years ago, at Oxford. Everyone knew it. She laughed at me, called me a fool. But that was in the past." His voice rose, a desperate edge creeping in. "I didn't want her dead." Clara, seated beside Harold, gasped softly, her hand tightening on her husband's. Harold's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering toward Lionel with a mix of suspicion and relief. Mrs. Finch, her stout frame rigid, stared at Lionel with a mixture of shock and indignation, as if offended by the implication that her kitchen had been the stage for such a crime. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet authority. "Mr. Drake, you were hurt by Miss Carver, weren't you? A public rejection, a wound that never healed. And her presence here, with that letter, did it stir those old feelings? Did you see a chance to make her pay?" Lionel's face crumpled, his hands dropping to his sides. "I didn't mean for her to die," he cried, his voice breaking. I wanted her to suffer, to feel what I felt. She was going to ruin everything, taunting me, saying she'd tell everyone I was a failure, that I'd never amount to anything." He sank into a chair, his shoulders heaving, tears welling in his eyes. "I got the cyanide from a friend, a chemist. I told him it was for research. I only meant to make her ill, to humiliate her in front of everyone. Just a small dose, I thought." Crane's eyes narrowed, his pen poised over his notebook. "You slipped it into her glass during the toast?" Lionel nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "When I set the tray down, everyone was talking, moving. I had the vial in my sleeve. It was easy to pour it, just a drop, while they were distracted. I wiped the glass after so there'd be no prints, but I didn't know it would kill her." His hands covered his face, and a sob escaped him. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp. She had seen such confessions before, guilt spilling out like water from a cracked vessel. Lionel's motive, rooted in the sting of a long-ago rejection, had been fanned into flame by Evelyn's letter and her presence at the wedding. The reenactment had exposed his sleight of hand, the scratch on his cufflink a silent witness to his act. Crane turned to Sergeant Baxter, who stood by the door. "Cuff him," he ordered quietly, "and get a full statement." As Baxter approached, Lionel offered no resistance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hand clutching Harold's, while Harold's face remained unreadable, a mix of relief and unease. Mrs. Finch, her indignation giving way to shock, muttered about the ruin of her reputation, though her relief was palpable. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and approached Crane. "A sad business, Inspector," she said softly. "A young man's pride, wounded years ago, can lead to terrible things." Crane nodded, his mustache twitching. "You saw it, didn't you? That cufflink, the way he moved during the reenactment." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a deceptive innocence. "Small things, Inspector, reveal the truth. A scratch, a gesture, a moment of weakness, they tell the story." Crane grunted, his respect for her evident. "We'll need to verify the chemist's involvement, but it's a solid case. The vial, the cufflink, his confession, it's enough." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts turning to the letter that had provoked Lionel's act. Evelyn's intention to set things right had been vague, but its menace had been enough to push a wounded man to desperation. Clara and Harold, she noted, were cleared of direct involvement, their secrets. Harold's past scandal, Clara's fierce loyalty, merely personal, not criminal. Mrs. Finch, too, was innocent, her only fault the open garden door that had allowed Lionel's access. As Lionel was led away, his head bowed, the library fell silent, the weight of the confession settling over the room. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythm. The truth had been uncovered, but at a cost. A life lost, a wedding tainted, a young man's future shattered. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a spurned lover had sabotaged a rival's garden, a petty act born of similar pain. Lionel's crime, though far graver, stemmed from the same human frailty. Crane approached her, his face weary but satisfied. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. That reenactment was a stroke of genius." She smiled, her expression serene. "People betray themselves, Inspector, when you watch closely. A moment of truth, caught in a gesture, is all it takes." He nodded, his thoughts already turning to the paperwork ahead. "We'll wrap this up today. The guests can go home, and the manor can breathe again." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind already drifting to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. The trap had been set, and the truth had sprung it. But the human heart, she knew, was a complex thing, capable of both great love and great harm. As the suspects dispersed, their faces etched with relief and sorrow, she felt a pang of sadness for the day that had begun with such promise and ended in such loss. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The morning sun rose higher over Henshaw Manor, its pale light filtering through the heavy clouds that hung low in the sky, casting a muted glow across the grand hall. The remnants of the wedding feast, scattered napkins, wilted roses, and abandoned glasses, remained untouched, a poignant reminder of the celebration that had been shattered by Evelyn Carver's death. The air, heavy with the scent of faded flowers and the lingering tension of the night's revelations, seemed to carry the weight of a tragedy resolved but not forgotten. The guests, released at last from the parlor's confines, began to disperse, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief, their voices subdued as they murmured farewells. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner, her knitting needles tracing their steady rhythm, observed the scene with a serene clarity, her thoughts lingering on the human frailties that had unraveled the day's joy. Inspector Crane, his weathered face softened by the resolution of the case, stood near the hall's entrance, overseeing the departure of the guests. Lionel Drake, now in custody, had been taken to the local station. His confession, a desperate act born of an old wound, ringing in the ears of those who had heard it. The vial fragments, the scratched cufflink, and the reenactment's revealing stumble had woven a net that caught him, but the cost was heavy. A life lost, a wedding tainted, a young man's future shadowed by guilt. Miss Marple's needles paused, her sharp eyes taking in the figures moving through the hall. Clara and Harold Winthrop, their hands clasped tightly, their faces pale but resolute. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, her stout frame bustling once more as she directed her staff to clear the tables, her relief tempered by the stain on her reputation. Clara, still in her ivory gown, though now creased and slightly wilted, approached Miss Marple, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Miss Marple," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "thank you. If you hadn't seen through it all, we might never have known the truth. This day, it was meant to be perfect." Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle, but her eyes twinkling with quiet wisdom. "My dear, perfection is a fragile thing, but you and Mr. Winthrop have each other, and that is a strength no tragedy can take away." She patted Clara's hand, noting the young woman's resilience. The way her grip on Harold's arm spoke of a determination to move forward. Harold, standing beside his bride, nodded, his jaw tight but his voice steady. "We'll put this behind us," he said, though his eyes betrayed a lingering unease. "Evelyn's death. It was a shock, but we'll start anew." Miss Marple noted the shadow in his expression, a remnant of the old scandal Evelyn had threatened to revive. His innocence in her death was clear, but the past, she knew, would always cast a faint shadow over his future. Mrs. Finch, pausing in her work, approached with a brisk nod. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice gruff but sincere. "I was sharp with you, thinking you suspected me. My business will take a hit, but I'm grateful the truth's out." Her hands smoothed her apron, a gesture of restored dignity, and Miss Marple saw the relief in her eyes, the burden of suspicion lifted. "You did your part well, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but firm. "An open door is no crime, but it's a lesson in vigilance." She thought of the garden door, its loose latch a silent accomplice to Lionel's act, and the vile fragments that had pointed to his guilt. Mrs. Finch's only fault had been her distraction, a small lapse in a day of chaos. As the guests drifted away, their cars crunching on the gravel drive, Miss Marple declined a ride back to St. Mary Mead, preferring the quiet walk through the village. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and roses, and she welcomed the chance to clear her mind. Her thoughts turned to Lionel, his confession echoing in her memory. A young man driven by the sting of rejection, his pride wounded by Evelyn's cruel laughter years ago. The letter, with its vague threat of revelation, had been the spark, reigniting a grudge that culminated in a fatal miscalculation. Miss Marple sighed, her needles tucked into her bag. She had seen such tragedies before: a spurned lover in St. Mary Mead, a petty feud turned deadly, a moment of weakness that led to ruin. The village of St. Mary Mead came into view, its cottages nestled among the hedgerows, its church spire piercing the morning mist. The familiar sight brought a sense of calm, a reminder of the quiet life she cherished. Yet her mind lingered on the manor, on the lives altered by a single act. Clara and Harold would rebuild, their love a foundation stronger than scandal. Mrs. Finch would weather the storm, her reputation bruised but intact. Lionel, however, faced a darker path, his future bound by the consequences of his actions. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village green, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "Love and hate," she murmured to herself, "are such close neighbors." The words, spoken softly, carried the weight of her years of observation, her understanding of the human heart's capacity for both joy and destruction. She thought of Evelyn, whose ambition and ruthlessness had sown the seeds of her own demise, and of Lionel, whose wounded pride had led him to a desperate act. As she resumed her walk, her steps light but purposeful, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the future. The manor would heal, its walls absorbing the tragedy as they had absorbed so many before. The village would gossip, the story of the deadly wedding toast growing into legend. But for now, she was content to return to her cottage, to her garden and her knitting, where the world's small mysteries could be pondered in peace. She glanced back at the manor, its silhouette fading into the mist. Another case solved, another truth uncovered. Yet the human heart, she knew, would always hold new secrets, new shadows to be explored. With a quiet smile, she turned toward home, her mind already drifting to the next sermon, the next tea, the next whisper of intrigue that might cross her path. Chapter 12. A Quiet Return. The morning sun had climbed higher, its light softening the edges of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar lanes to her cottage. The village was stirring to life, its cottages glowing with the gentle warmth of late summer, their gardens abloom with dahlias and late roses. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant chime of the church bell, a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil that had unfolded at Henshaw Manor. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her thoughts lingering on the tragedy that had unraveled over the past day. The deadly wedding toast, with its web of motives and betrayals, had been resolved, but the echoes of human frailty remained, as they always did. Her cottage, a modest affair with ivy-clad walls and a neatly tended garden, welcomed her with its quiet familiarity. She paused at the gate, her sharp eyes taking in the orderly rows of hollyhocks and the small bench where she often sat to ponder the village's secrets. Inside, the kettle was soon on, its cheerful whistle filling the cozy kitchen as she prepared a pot of tea. Settling by the fire in her parlor, her knitting resumed, those pale blue stitches for the neighbor's newborn, a comforting ritual that grounded her thoughts. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room, and Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case of Evelyn Carver's death had been a study in the complexities of the human heart. Lionel Drake, driven by a long-buried wound, had mistaken vengeance for justice, his act of poisoning a desperate bid to reclaim his pride. The vile fragments, the scratched cufflink, the reenactment's revealing stumble. These had been the threads that led to his confession, each a small detail that Miss Marple's keen eye had woven into truth. She thought of Clara Winthrop, whose fierce loyalty to Harold had shielded him from suspicion, and Harold himself, whose past rivalry with Evelyn had cast a shadow but not a crime. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, her pride bruised by a lost contract, had been innocent, her open garden door merely a lapse that allowed Lionel's fatal act. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a village girl had poisoned a rival's cider, driven by jealousy over a suitor's affection. The motive had been simpler, but the outcome no less tragic. A reminder that the smallest slights could fester into deadly deeds. Lionel's confession had laid bare his pain, but it had also closed a chapter, allowing the manor to begin its healing. The village, she knew, would soon be abuzz with the tale of the deadly wedding toast. Mrs. Lavinia Price, no doubt, was already regaling her tea-shop companions with embellished accounts of the drama, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. Let them talk, she thought. Gossip was the village's lifeblood, but the truth, as she had found it, was quieter, rooted in the subtle interplay of human emotions. Her thoughts drifted to the sermon she would hear on Sunday, likely a reflection on forgiveness or the perils of pride. The vicar, a gentle soul with a penchant for long-winded homilies, would no doubt draw parallels to the manor's tragedy, though he would never know the full story. Miss Marple's role, as always, would remain in the shadows, her insights shared only with those who needed them. Inspector Crane, perhaps, or the occasional confidant like Dr. Haydock. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and moved to the window, her gaze settling on the garden. The roses, still in bloom, nodded gently in the breeze, their beauty a quiet rebuke to the darkness she had witnessed. The world, she knew, was full of such contrasts. Love and hate, joy and sorrow, truth and deception. Her gift, honed over years of quiet observation, was to see through the veils people drew around themselves, to find the small details that revealed their hearts. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her tea cooling beside her. The case was closed, the manor's shadows dispelled, but another mystery, she knew, would soon emerge. A whispered rumor, a glance too long held, a secret buried in plain sight. These were the threads that wove the fabric of St. Mary Mead. She would be ready, her needles at hand, her mind sharp, to unravel them when the time came. With a contented sigh, she took up her knitting once more, the pale blue shawl growing stitch by stitch. The village was at peace for now, and Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, was content to let it be. The deadly wedding toast was a memory, a lesson in the fragility of human pride. And as the evening's peace settled over her, she turned her thoughts to the simple pleasures of home, knowing the truth would always find its way to her, as it always did.